evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks today. Forgive my laughter, but just before the credits disappeared and I'm supposed to make the introduction, a voice from the control room very loudly said, "Shut up," talking to our cameraman who was talking to me. You know, their timing is immaculate. You're all poised to make a nice, dignified, this is a terribly serious program, and here we are. I'm giggling like a schoolgirl. Never mind. We enjoy what we do here. We enjoy the work. Well, I think we do. We enjoy the work, and there's nothing that says Christians can't be light-hearted, even when we're talking about our faith. In fact, especially when we're talking about our faith, we should be that way, don't you think? I don't have anything like last week. I had a social comment to make. I think I kind of exhausted my repertoire because nothing's happened since the last time I spoke to you, which has only been about half an hour for me, been a week for you, I know, to bring anything to mind. Hopefully that you made a couple of notes during the last program, and we'll follow up on some of the things I suggested. Now, if you'll remember, we were talking about, I know the title doesn't say it, we're talking about the publican, you know, the tax collector, and we're going to do that for a few minutes, and then we'll get on to the title of the program called Exiles, and we'll see where it goes. The one thing about looking at all these different questions that people have asked to be, you know, gone into more detail is you kind of jump around all over the place, which may be fun for some, and other people like to hear a nice steady 10-week dissertation on something more profound. The thing about, and I was sharing this with the crew in the wake there, you know, you read the Bible and it says Jesus went to a publican's house, or Jesus called Matthew, Levi, you know, to come and be an apostle, and Zacchaeus, who we're going to talk about in a minute. And they were publicans, and nobody liked them, you know. And we just sort of go, oh, okay, fine. Well, Jesus liked everybody, you know. You have no conception, just a casual reading of the Bible, and that's what most of us do. Let's be honest. It's a casual reading. We have no conception of exactly where that publican stood in the minds of the people around him. I mean, he was, if you let's say he was an Ebola carrying drug addict pedophile, okay, that's about the social standing that he would have had in Jewish society. Jesus didn't just pull one of them city officials to a side and said, "That's okay, you can come and be my disciple." He pulled the lowest of the low. It's like I was saying at the end of last week, Jesus didn't just get put to death for being proclaiming to be the Son of God, which is basically what he was put to death for. He got put to death in the most agonizing possible way that existed at the time, making the point of what he was prepared to do for us. Something we forget. So even when you're sitting there thinking Jesus couldn't love me, I'm a low down, no, whatever you are, if you are, and the answer is yes, he could. Look at the people he did bring up and take with him. Okay, so we're talking about the publicans, and the thing is interesting when you read it. Although it's only mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew actually leaves the parable of the publican, the parable that Jesus uses, in Luke, because perhaps because he's the chap they're talking about. I don't know. Okay, in the New Testament, there's something called publicani. When they're not mentioned, that you don't see that word in the New Testament. The publicani were generally, as I said last week, these wealthy Roman knights or you know, people of stature who paid a fixed sum into the treasury in publicum. That's what the treasury was called in Latin, right? The taxes and customs and all that of various provinces. Now remember, the publican, the tax collector, wasn't just collecting taxes, he was also collecting customs duties. So he got money from people coming in to the province and people going out of the province. Okay, and under those Roman knights, as I said, there were the chief of publicans, of whom our friend Zacchaeus was. He was the chief of publicans. In other words, he wasn't just a regular publican, he was the head honcho in that area. Okay, and then after, below him, of course, he had people like Matthew, who collected the money, you know, or whatever they were getting, and they didn't just deal in money. I mean, it wasn't always in money. I mean, in all the good Bible films and that sort of thing, you always see people exchanging money, but sometimes it was goods as well. Okay, and the office, his office, if you like, was at city gates or on public roads or bridges. You know, bridges make sense. Everybody's got to go through the bridge to get across the river, and so the tax collector would say, "Oh, just a minute. What do you got there?" You know, city gates coming into the city. Every city had a gate or gates. So you know, coming in, let's see, you've got 4 donkeys and 4 loads of. That's going to be so and so, okay. And Levi, Matthew's post, as far as we can understand, was on the road between Damascus and the seaports, the big seaports, Phoenicia, Jericho, and in fact, historically, Zacchaeus' headquarters was the centre of the balsam trade, you know, the balsam scent. So it was pretty wealthy position. I mean, the fact that Jesus preferred a publican's house to any of the priests in Jericho, I mean, said at the time, historically we're told that there was about 12,000 of them. I mean, to be honest, that's a lot of priests, isn't it? There must have been a priest for every 3rd person who lived there. I'm not sure what the population of Jericho was then, but 12,000 priests in one city. It's a lot of religion, isn't it? And because of that, because Jesus selects Zacchaeus out of all of that, which is what got the bigoted Jewish people all over him. I mean, even the chief publican was criticised, although he was kind of upmarket status, you know, more of the landed gentry, and didn't actually get his hands dirty collecting the money. It said, you know, in Luke 13 that he took from men by false accusation rather than unfairly exacted or extorted. He just said, you know, made assumptions about what they were carrying or what they were selling. Okay, and also John Baptist in one of his things says, exact no more than that which is appointed to you. Well, obviously Zacchaeus was trying to take more to justify his big house and all the rest of it, you know. But as I said last week, the publican, the common publican, the guy who actually got his greasy hands on the money, or got his hands on the greasy money, whichever, was the one that made the office so hateful. I mean, God's elect, chosen nation are being subject to pagan tolls and taxes and this sort of thing. I mean, and in fact, as I said before, most Jews thought it was unlawful to pay tribute to pagans. So you paid your taxes and then you went to the temple and asked for forgiveness. Put you in a bit of a cleft stick, didn't it? All right? And again, the big thing was that the publicans, in the eyes of their countrymen, were traitors. You know how we feel about traitors, even in modern day. Israel had these high hopes. It was God's nation, supposed to lead the world, and here are these guys supporting its subjection to the Romans and making money off it. I mean, the hatred and the anger that people felt just hardened people's hearts. They really did. If you want to take the two extremes, the Pharisees were the respectable and supposedly religious class, and the publicans were the vile and degraded. They were the two ends of the strata, okay? The rabbis used to say, get this, that if your family had a robber in it, a thief, that disgraced your whole family. The fact that the rest of you led blameless, upright, forthright, you know, worshipping God, going to the temple, paying your dues, etc., didn't matter a thing if one of you was a robber, a thief. That's like saying today that if a family has one bad apple in it, everybody's bad. We hopefully we've come a long way from those times. But one publican in a family was exactly the same. Promises, promises. You know, you promise to do something. I promise to pay you. I promise to go and work in your yard. I promise to do this. Were not to be kept with murderers, thieves, and publicans. That's the sort of level they were at. The synagogue alms box, you know, the box where the poor money is in, and the temple korban, which was the money to pay for the temple upkeep, must not receive their money. A publican couldn't put money into the poor box. I mean, you know, try that today. Not likely, is it? Seriously, can you imagine churches who have poor boxes? I don't know many that do. I know Catholic churches do, and one or two others. But imagine saying, okay, if any member of your family's been a thief, you're considered a thief, and we won't accept your money. You believe it? Not accepting the money? Okay. You couldn't use money if a publican owed you money and paid you back. You know, you couldn't receive it. Okay. And they couldn't, and here's the big thing, they couldn't be a judge, they couldn't even give testimony in court. So if a publican saw this man murder that man, he couldn't give evidence in court to that, even though, you know, he'd saw it with his own eyes. Wasn't allowed. And so you can see here how big a demonstration it was when Jesus goes to eat with them. He could have probably, because he was well known, and the Pharisees, whilst they may not have liked his message, had respect for him. He could have said, "Boy, I'm hungry. Where shall we go?" And out of the 12,000 priests, somebody would have said, "Hey, come and eat with me, Jesus." But no, he goes and eats in the house of a publican, and then after that, chooses Matthew as an apostle. And I think what really hurt, and we see the parable, and we read it, but it probably doesn't convey. Hopefully today it conveys more than you would have thought about it, where he talks about the self-condemned publican. Lord, be gracious to me, I'm a sinful man, and the self-satisfied Pharisee. At least the publican wasn't a hypocrite. I mean, he was a bad boy. He knew it, and he was, you know, Lord, be merciful to me, I'm a sinner. And yet, hated by all, they become a friend of the most holy one of all, which, in my view, says there's hope for us all. Hopefully none of us are quite as bad as the publican was in then. But, you know, there are people who have led lives of some reproach and probably feel like Jesus or God wouldn't accept them because they're so bad. And yet we have ample proof from the Bible itself that Jesus will accept all of us if you're truly contrite. So anyway, hopefully that answers the question I had from my friend who was concerned about publicans. No? All right, well, maybe we'll deal with it again another day. Next, I want to pick up one. We're going to go back to the Old Testament here. I was in a discussion with some friends, and they were friends, over coffee one morning, and one of them said, I have a big problem with the rebuilding of the temple after the return from the exile in Babylon. You know, all of a sudden everybody comes back, and all of a sudden the temple goes up, and you know, it doesn't sit right. And of course you explain that the Bible is not intended to be a day-by-day historical account of what happened, but as a general, here's what we did, here's what happened. But there are some things in it we might look at. Now, so here we go. The Israelites are no longer exiled. They're no longer forced to stay in Babylon. They can go home. Okay? And so, you have that long story in the Bible where they pack up their stuff and start moving back. First of all, most scholars, and I tend to agree with them, believe it wasn't one big move. Granted, the amount of people they say moved back, I have no argument with that, but it wasn't one big move. but a lot of little ones. You know, little groups. You can't, if you look at Babylon to Jerusalem, even today on the map, you'll see that it's not exactly an easy trip. Now today there's probably a freeway that goes there, but back then it was desert. So you can't move thousands and thousands of people across the desert all at once. There isn't the water, there isn't the support, there isn't anything. So you go in relatively small doses. And not all the people who went back were poor. You get the impression from the Bible and from extracurricular outside stories that the people who left Babylon were the poor and the downtrodden, and they wanted to get out and make a new start. Some of them weren't. Some of them were wealthy. I said when I talked about this a few years ago that I can imagine when they got together in the temple and said, in the temples or the synagogues, and said, the rulers lifted the edict, we can go back. And a lot of them looked at themselves and said, we've been here 50, 60 years. I've got a business, my son's got a business, I'm doing well, I'm in the hotel business, or I'm in the jewelry trade, or I'm in the money lending trade. Why would I go back? I'm making a fortune. So it took a pretty big step in faith for some of these people to go back, and you have to remember that in the context of the story. But the question my friend had was, whose land did they use when they got back? Whose houses? And what happened to the occupants of those houses? And the Bible is very silent on that. Now, if half the population moved off to Babylon for 50 odd years, what happened to the land that was left? Now, okay, the Samaritans may have started drifting down and taking over it, and of course not everybody went. The Bible doesn't say clearly on this, but it's pretty obvious that not everyone inhabiting the land left. Some people stayed, working under Persian rule. So there was a fair amount of Israelites, if you will, even if they weren't practicing their faith. There was a fair amount of Israelites in the country, working the land, perhaps working, one cousin stayed and the others got taken into captivity. Who knows? The Bible's very, very quiet on this, and I think it was because it was an awkward time and the Bible writers didn't want to make too much of it. But I believe when they came back to partially populated lands, partially, tilled lands. And they stayed and gradually got themselves settled. You can't just walk in and say, okay, we're here, let's have supper, and tomorrow we'll start building the temple. It wasn't like that. Ezra says that soon after the arrival, they started building the temple. Well, I think Ezra was taking what we call poetic licenses, because even back then, there's a certain amount of infrastructure you have to have in place if you're going to build a house or temple. You need wood and stone and masonry and all the things for a building site, for a start. Then you've got to have a workforce to do it. And if you've just arrived in the land, who's planting the crops? Who's tilling the ground? Who's, working on the olive trees? Who's providing the food and the shelter for everybody? So it's very possible that the Israelites spent a great deal of time doing that. They had to eat something, they had to live somewhere, had to build houses. So things didn't happen quite as quickly as Ezra would have us believe. In fact, if you look at the archaeological, that's the right word, yes, artifacts, that's another good word, from that period, if you look at some of the historical stuff, and there's hordes of the stuff in the books in the library, I picked out 3 at random, it shows them living at a very low level, very impoverished level, just barely above, just barely making it. And you can see that some of them probably thought, just like they did when they left Egypt with Moses, what have we done? We left the comfort of Babylon, and at least a house, and now look at me, I'm living in a rock shelter and having to dig the ground for things. So let's look at the time frame for a minute. We're not going to get through all this today, but we'll try. The move starts at about 537 BC, okay? They start moving, all right? Then Cyrus, dies 7 years later in 530, and he's the chap who said, you know, you can go. Okay, Cambyses II follows him from about 530 to 522. That's another 8 years. So 7 years with Cyrus, 8 years with Cambyses, and it wasn't until Darius, read Ezra, it wasn't until the reign of Darius in 522 that the actual temple building began. So, in fact, you got 15 years between the first move and the temple building, according to Ezra. So it wasn't shortly after they arrived. I think it's poetic license, as I said. They had to set up, get established, and maybe 15 years is about long enough, which is why I think it was a slow movement, different groups coming at different times. I imagine the first group didn't have many women and kids in it. It was guys coming in to, what do we got? Let's make a shelter, and then send for the wife and kids, or the matriarchs, or whatever, Okay? I mean, what Darius did, he confirmed the original Cyrus edict, doesn't he? Darius says, yeah, you can go, we already said that. But it's 15 years later. The Bible tends to telescope time down to make things happen fairly quickly, and in fact, it doesn't happen like that. Okay, so the foundation started, we think, about 520. The foundations for the temple. Now bear in mind, you can't say, well, the foundations were already there. No, they weren't. They were knocked down completely. And probably over the years, the 50 years that they were in captivity, most of the stonework and everything was used to build houses, which is the way they did it in those days, taken away and used in other places, all right? So 17 years after the initial move, they start building it, okay? But the actual finishing construction, again, with Ezra, was not completed until 515 BC. 22 years. A very long, slow time. So lots of things happening all the time. Okay? The city wall around there, and this is one of my friends had a really big question about the city wall. That had to wait. If you think about it, when did Nehemiah comes? It's in Nehemiah's time, right? Almost 100 years after the temple was completed, did they do the city wall during the reign of Artaxerxes in 444. Okay? They had the temple going, they're building it, but they don't get around to the wall around the city, such as it was, until 100 years later. And Nehemiah's got this interesting story in Nehemiah 6, which says the walls were built in 52 days. Well, let's be a little reasonable here. It's impossible for a start. And Nehemiah 2, chapter 2, states that all the walls were broken down and the gates burnt, right? So, why were they in such a big hurry to build it up? What had happened to make it happen? Well, what was happening is the Samaritans in the neighbouring, who were in there taken over during the captivity, they were getting a bit anxious about Jerusalem being fortified, because you've got a fortified city, you command a certain amount of respect. So the Samaritans basically were unhappy about it. All right, and given past history, the way the Jews treat the Samaritans is pretty reasonable. So we go back to the archaeology again, and archaeology tells us that the walls were repaired, not rebuilt, repaired, and basically with anything they could find. Anything they could find to build. So all the rocks and rubble and stuff like that, they basically built a pile. What they did was give them something that they could hide behind or stand behind in case they were attacked. So Nehemiah's 52 days, I think, is again a bit of poetic license. They basically built a rampart or a stone dike, whatever you want to call it, around the city. Now, of course, Jerusalem is very small in those days. So we're not talking about, a place the size of Florence or somewhere like that. It's a very small city. Okay? So they built them with anything they could find. And then we have that story about the Holy Temple fire. It's in Maccabees, which we Protestants don't read very much. It's in the Apocrypha. But the source of the Holy Temple fire, this everlasting fire that burnt in the temple. And the story goes that the descendants of the priests that hid it initially went to find it. And they make this big description about it. It's not fire, but thick water. Thick water, okay? And they call it nephtha in Maccabees too. Naphtha, oil. Okay? It's a Babylonian word, actually. But in the source of the temple fire, this everlasting light, was in fact oil lamps, or oil burning in a lamp, which of course we take for granted now, but back then not quite so obvious. And not many Protestants read Maccabees. It's in the Apocrypha, it's not in your Bible, so unless you make a concerted effort. But you need to read that. Maccabees is a great source of historical information about that period of time, something that our Bible doesn't have in it, okay? And what's really important, and we'll finish this up next week, it seems that at this time, the Jews realized that they weren't going to have a monarchy anymore. There was no royal family, all the leaders were priests, Ezra, Nehemiah, people like that. So they opted for what they eventually became renowned for, was this inward-looking religious community. They didn't worry about the rest of the world, they just looked after themselves. And we have the establishment of a theocracy, with, of course, Persian approval, because the Persians didn't care. As long as there wasn't a king inciting revolution, they were fine. And we'll finish that up next week. Try and get a copy of a Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, or there's books in the library with it. Read Maccabees. It's a fascinating historical insight. And we'll be back next time. Good night.